speaker for the evening. I couldn't memorize this, so I'm just going to read it. Our next speaker is a respected voice in Alberta's political conversation. Michael Wagner is a senior Alberta columnist for the Western Standard, where he offers clear, thoughtful analysis on provincial politics, history, and the ongoing debate over Alberta's place within Canada. With decades of experience studying Alberta's political movements and writing extensively about Western autonomy, Michael brings a deep understanding of the issues at the heart of Alberta sovereignty. Michael has a PhD in political science and has authored several books on Alberta politics and the independent movement. Today, he'll share his insights on where this movement has come from, what drives it, and where it might be headed. Please join me in welcoming Michael Wagner.
Thank you, Noah, for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. Just have to make sure I got this adjusted for my eyesight properly. One of the things that always impressed me when I first began to speak for Alberta Prosperity Project is that the meeting begin with prayer. I really appreciate that. I think that's important, and I thought that was a very awesome prayer. Now, just before I start my talk, I just wanted to show you guys the front of this morning's National Post. The main central article there, it says, Alberta separatists woo support in the White House. It's largely about Dr. Dennis Modry and the Alberta Prosperity Project. So Alberta Prosperity Project is mentioned right there in the center of the National Post from this morning's National Post. Yeah. They don't often give that much coverage on the front cover to one particular issue. So I was like, wow, when I saw that this morning. So tonight I want to talk about why I think Alberta needs to become independent. Excuse me. So to properly understand the need for Alberta independence, it's necessary to look at Alberta's history. It's easiest to understand independence sentiment as building over time, because for generations, Westerners have felt that they have been ignored or even exploited within Canada, and eventually this feeling has reached the point where it is now, where many of us believe that Alberta should become independent. The U.S. Declaration of Independence uses the phrase "a long train of abuses" to explain why the 13 colonies should become independent from the United States. There had been a long train of abuses by the British government toward the colonies, and I believe also Alberta has experienced a long train of abuses from Ottawa and the federal government that explains why we need to become independent. So the sense that Canadian Confederation has been unfair to the West has been building for many years. Like this part of North America used to be called Rupert's Land. It was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, for fur trading territory. And in 1870, Canada purchased Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, there was many people already living here, especially in the Red River settlement, which is now Manitoba. Those people were not consulted about becoming part of Canada. Canada just purchased Rupert's Land and annexed it to Canada without consulting the people who were already living here. And that lack of consultation was one of the reasons that led to the first Riel Rebellion. A lot of those people didn't appreciate being annexed to another country without being consulted. So there was evidence of Western discontent with Canada right from the very beginning of Western settlement. Then, of course, the prairies were filled with pioneers to create an agricultural economy here. But there was disadvantages that our farmers experienced here that others didn't experience in the East. There was a protective tariff to ensure that Western farmers had to purchase their farming equipment from Eastern Canada. So they had to pay higher prices because of that tariff. Back in those days, the federal government loved tariffs to protect Canada from the United States. That meant, of course, the farmers had to pay higher prices than they would have otherwise. Also, they had to sell their grain through middlemen, and they had to pay the transportation costs. So they ended up paying more for their equipment and receiving less for their grain. So, this was very disadvantageous for our farmers out here. Now, this led, of course, to a considerable Western disenchantment even back then. That's well over 100 years ago. And you won't be able to see this cartoon very well, but many of you will be familiar with this cartoon. It's a cow standing over Canada, and he's being fed by the three prairie provinces, and Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal are taking the milk. This is a very famous cartoon from 1915. So this is from 110 years ago already. People were concerned here about how they were being treated by Central Canada. So this discontent on the prairies led to political action. Like it didn't lead to any action towards becoming independent, but it did lead to significant political action, usually through abandoning the mainstream political parties and founding alternative political parties to use, especially here in Alberta. So you might remember from the 1920s into the 1930s, our government was United Farmers of Alberta. That was the governing party at the provincial level. At the federal level, the main political party here was the Progressive Party of Canada, a farmers' party. So these were alternative parties because the people here rejected the Central Canadian mainstream parties. But the most significant alternative party actually in Alberta was a Social Credit Party. A Social Credit Party was elected in 1935, led by William Bible Bill Aberhart, who had been a radio evangelist. This was so significant. It was worldwide news when Alberta elected a social credit government. It was talked about around the world, and it put Alberta on the map. And if you might remember Ted Byfield, the founder of Alberta Report magazine, this is what he wrote about Alberta's election of social credit in 1935. While other provinces whined about the Depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough, and we will strike back. That was our record, and that is our reputation. So that was how Alberta was thought of back in those days. So Alberta did fight back against Central Canada, but not by trying to become independent. It was just through these alternative political movements. Now, that all changed when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in 1968. When Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister, a threshold was crossed, and for the very first time, Western Canadians began to think seriously about becoming an independent country. Now, the first separatist organizing in Alberta began about 1970, 2 years after Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. Now, one of the things that Pierre Trudeau did originally to trigger Western independence sentiment was he brought in the Official Languages Act. So that made French much more prominent across Canada, and in particular on the prairies, because Pierre Trudeau had gotten in politics, partly at least, to try and make Quebecers feel more at home right across Canada, and part of that was making French prominent everywhere. And so a lot of Westerners felt that they were having French thrust down their throats. So not coincidentally then, the very first book written about Western independence was published in 1971. It was called The Unfinished Revolt, Some Views on Western Independence. It was a collection of essays edited by John Barr and Owen Anderson. And that's significant because John Barr was the executive assistant to Alberta's Minister of Education. And Owen Anderson was the executive assistant to Alberta Premier Harry Strom, our last social credit premier. So these were influential people here in Alberta. So they collected these articles to publish about the theme of Western independence. Now, most of the essays did not favor Western independence, but John Barr's was the most in that direction. And basically, John Barr came to the conclusion we've got two options. First, we got to try and fix Canada. We'll try and fix Canada, and then if we can't fix Canada, then we need to become independent. So he wrote that in 1971. Like, that's an idea that's still around today, but that idea is over 50 years old. The idea of first trying to fix Canada and then then becoming independent if we can't fix Canada. That was a great idea in 1971 because we hadn't done anything yet, but it's not such a great idea anymore because we have been trying for 50 years to fix Canada and it hasn't worked. So basically then, though, the most significant impetus for the growth of the independence movement in Alberta was the result of the energy crisis that began in 1973. There's a war in the Middle East that began in October 1973 when Arab countries attacked Israel. And that led to the price of oil skyrocketing because up until that time in 1973, the price of oil for many years had been about $3 a barrel. So it was good. Alberta had oil and it took us out of poverty. You know, it was a great resource for us. But at $3 a barrel, like, it wasn't a massive windfall that we got from that resource. But when the price of oil went from $3 a barrel to about $12 a barrel in just a few weeks, it looked like Alberta was going to really cash in on oil for the first time, more than ever before. But our Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, did a couple of things to make sure Alberta could not cash in the way it ought to have. For one, he created an artificial price of oil within Canada so that the price of oil sold within Canada was much lower than the world price. So we'd have to sell our oil from Alberta to central Canada at a price much less than the world price. We didn't get the money that we should have been getting. And Alberta was already selling oil to the United States, and Trudeau put an export tax on our oil for the first time in Canadian history. It was unprecedented in Canadian history to put an export tax on a provincial resource. So we were selling the oil to the United States at the world price, and the federal government would take a huge percentage of that they were not entitled to. And our premier at the time, Peter Lougheed, called it, quote, the biggest ripoff of any province that's ever occurred in Confederation's history. He said that in 1974 already. That's what Trudeau was doing to us. So Peter Lougheed throughout the 1970s was fighting for Alberta to get a fair price for its resource, fighting with Trudeau. And the first major independence organization was formed in Alberta in 1974 called the Independent Alberta Association. So throughout the 70s, we had this fight between Peter Lougheed and Pierre Trudeau. Then in 1979, Pierre Trudeau lost a federal election to Joe Clark, but Joe Clark won only a minority government. And it was believed his government would be much better for Alberta, because Joe Clark was actually from Alberta, of course. But his government, because it was a minority government, it fell in a vote of non-confidence in December 1979, and there was a new federal election for February of 1980. So during that February 1980, or during that 1980 election campaign, the Trudeau Liberals made it very clear that they would favor the eastern provinces over the oil-producing provinces. One of the main Liberal campaign activists at that time was Keith Davey, and he mentioned that their campaign slogan for that election was "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." Basically, they were telling Eastern Canada, if you re-elect us as Liberals, we'll put Alberta in its place and we'll get you cheap energy. And so, of course, Central Canada did put the Liberals back in with Trudeau as Prime Minister. Now, there's something also important about this election, is that up until this time, like, federal parties usually try to focus on national unity. Like in any large country like Canada, various regions have different interests. And so the top leaders try to create a national unity, try to ease the differences between the different regions. But in this federal election, the Liberals decided to deliberately emphasize regional differences and make the regional divisions worse through their federal election campaign. So the federal Liberals are actually much to blame for a lot of the regional division within Canada. Like, that's kind of been one of their campaign themes in 1980 and since that time to one degree or another. So Westerners were very angry that Trudeau was returned as Prime Minister in February of 1980, and more support for independence began to grow. Then in October 1980, Trudeau's government brought in the National Energy Program, which devastated Alberta's economy. Like, that National Energy Program was basically a federal power grab over Alberta's energy industry, and it devastated our economy. And actually, I've met a number of people at going to meetings like this who remember what happened in 1980. And you have people that'll say, my dad lost his job, or our family lost our house. And I've even met 3 different people just in the last few months who knew of people who actually knew people personally, or knew of people who committed suicide because of the devastation of the National Energy Program. Like, that's how bad it was for Alberta. It was just awful. But the National Energy Program and Trudeau did something to change Alberta's political culture. Before 1980, whenever surveys were done about support for independence in Alberta, the percentage of support would be a single digit, like 5 or 6 or 7%. From 1980 onwards, when they've done surveys of support for independence in Alberta, it's always been double digit. Like, in the early days, maybe 15 or 16%. Afterwards, be often 20 or 25%. Like, that's usually the floor of a support for separatism or for independence in Alberta when polling is done. So Pierre Trudeau permanently changed our political culture by giving credibility to the idea of Alberta independence. And that is why I say Pierre Trudeau is the father of the Alberta independence movement. He created it with his policies, literally. No other province in Canadian history has been attacked the way Alberta was attacked by the federal government. No province has ever been attacked this way before or since. That's something that's unique about Alberta, the way they've attacked us. Anyway, of course, there was large support for independence at that time. In 1982, there was a provincial by-election that was won by a separatist candidate, Gordon Kessler of the Western Canada Concept, the only time an independence candidate has ever been elected in Western Canada. Now, although a lot of people were looking at independence at this time and supporting it, there are many others who believed, as we've talked about in the past, that Canada could be fixed and reformed in a way that would be beneficial for Alberta. Among these people was Senator Ernest Manning. Ernest Manning had been Alberta's longest-serving premier, and after he was premier, he was appointed to the Senate. So in 1981, he and 2 other very prominent citizens wrote a book called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. It was published by the Canada West Foundation in Calgary. And basically, they argued that Canada needed to have some institutional reforms to improve regional representation in our national government, in our national institutions, because we don't have proper Western representation in the Senate and the other national institutions. But if those national institutions could be reformed so that we could get a Western voice in the national government, then Westerners wouldn't feel left out as if we have to pull out and form our own country. So if the national institutions, they argued, were not reformed, then there'd be much stronger support for Western independence. And they particularly focused on Senate reform. This is about the time when Senate reform got going. They figured if we could reform the Senate so we could get proper Western representation in the national government, that's what we would need to fix the country. And they proposed this in 1981, which is right when the constitutional negotiations were going on, with Pierre Trudeau and the provinces. So that was the time to propose these reforms, but their reforms, of course, were ignored, and nothing happened with that. Now, Pierre Trudeau resigned in 1984. He was replaced by John Turner. A few months later, there was a federal election, and Brian Mulroney's Conservatives won a massive majority government. And so Albertans and other Westerns figured everything was going to be okay now. You know, we got rid of Liberals, we got rid of Trudeau, we've got our guy now in as Prime Minister, because every Alberta member of Parliament was Progressive Conservative, so it looked like things had been fixed and everything's going to be okay. Unfortunately, it did not turn out that way. Brian Mulroney and his Conservative government began to favor central Canada, just like Pierre Trudeau had done, although not to the same degree. Now, one of the big issues that came up just a couple years after Mulroney was elected was that Canada had purchased recently the CF-18 fighter jets at that time, and it was a very expensive government contract to maintain those fighter jets. There was 2 cities in Canada with the facilities to maintain the fighter jets, Winnipeg and Montreal. So the government held a competition. Which of these cities had the best facilities? Winnipeg, according to the government criteria, won the government contract. And so Mulroney awarded it to Montreal for political reasons. So once again, the West was ripped off, this time by the Conservative government. So a Conservative government is always better for Alberta than a Liberal government. There's no question about that. The Conservatives are better. But in every case in Canada, any party that wants to form the federal government has to win the support of Central Canada. They have to put Central Canada's interests first in every case. So even the Conservatives will put the Central Canada's interests before Alberta's interests, because otherwise they can't be the government. You know, even Pierre Poilievre, like, I'm not saying he's a bad guy. Maybe in his heart of hearts, he's, you know, he really loves Alberta, but he supports the equalization program the way it is. He said that he'd only make minor changes if he had the opportunity. He wouldn't change it because he has to support that if he's going to get votes in Quebec, right? He also said he supports keeping Canada in the Paris Climate Accord, which, you know, is kind of the fundamental basis for the climate change policies that the federal government initiates. And he also wants Alberta to stay in the Canadian pension program and not form form an Alberta pension plan. So, you know, like I say, I'm not saying he's a bad guy, but he has to say these things. He has to take these positions if he wants to become prime minister. And every politician in a major political party is going to take these kinds of positions because they want to win. That's, you know, their goal as a politician. So the Conservatives are better, but, you know, they're not a solution to our problems. If we elect Pierre Poilievre as prime minister, that's a reprieve from the Liberals, but it's not a solution. We're just going to end up with the Liberals again and have the same problems over again. Now, the CF-18 fighter jet situation led to a huge uproar in Western Canada, which led to the creation of the Reform Party of Canada under Preston Manning. Now, Preston Manning and the party in the early years, their motto was "the West wants in." Like the West had been left out of decision-making by the national government, and we wanted, the purpose of the Reform Party was so we could elect members of parliament from the West, that we could send and get our voice heard in the federal government. Now, one of the pamphlets that was created at that time, this is a photocopy of a pamphlet from 1987, a new federal political party to represent the West. This is 1987. It was a pamphlet, you know, promoting the creation of the Reform Party. I just want to read a couple of sentences from here to see, so you know what they're talking about here. Excuse me. Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. Our political and economic development is being hamstrung by the vested interests of the Golden Triangle establishment of Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. The Western economy continues to languish, and Western influence in national economic and political decision-making is insufficient to bring about meaningful change. So that was written in 1987. I think that's 38 years ago. 38 years ago, and you can write the exact same thing today. Nothing has changed since this was written in 1987. Thank you. Now, the following year in 1988, a member of parliament from Edmonton named David Kilgour, a Progressive Conservative Party MP, he wrote a book called Uneasy Patriots, Western Canadians and Confederation. Now, David Kilgour was a good guy, and he wrote this book to explain to other Canadians why Westerners are unhappy within Canada. And he concluded his book this way: "The time has come to address a long-standing injustice and bring the West into equal partnership with all other regions of the country." So in 1988, over 35 years ago, the time had come to address this long-standing injustice. And it has not been addressed since that time. But at the time he wrote that in 1988, the Reform Party was on the rise. And so it looked at that time, well, maybe we'll finally be able to address these issues. Now, a major goal of the Reform Party was to reform the Constitution by creating a Triple E Senate. So a Triple E Senate is a Senate which would be elected. Like right now, even our senators are not elected. They're appointed by the Prime Minister. But if we had a Senate that was elected and was equal representation from each province, so we had equal number of senators from each province, because we don't have that, and if they had equal effective powers, so elected, equal from each province, equal number from each province, and effective powers as a Triple E Senate. If we had a Senate like that in Canada, Western Canadian influence could be heard within the national government. So that's what they campaigned for. And actually it began to build some momentum by the late 1980s as well, because our premier at the time, Don Getty, he officially endorsed the Triple E Senate concept. He actually created a committee to promote it across Canada. And he held Canada's first ever Senate election. Again, in October 1989, you might remember, there was an election where General Stan Waters of the Reform Party was elected as a senator, and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney actually then appointed him to the Senate for Alberta. That was the first Senate election in Canadian history. You know, it's a consultative election because the Prime Minister still had the power to appoint or not appoint, but he did appoint the one we elected. And Alberta's had, I think, 4 other consultative elections since then, you know, where we elect people. And in some cases, Stephen Harper appointed some of those to the Senate. So it looked like Senate reform was on a roll, but basically it came to a halt at that point. So the Reform Party, though, won 52 seats in the 1993 election. Like almost all of Alberta's seats were Reform Party. Then in 1997, it won 60 seats. Of course, again, almost all of Alberta's seats were with Reform Party. But the Reform Party began to change by that time. By the late 1990s, they began to focus more on trying to become a national party that would win power rather than representing Western Canadian interests. So in the year 2000, it transformed itself into the Canadian Alliance Party. And then in 2003, it merged itself with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the new Conservative Party of Canada under Stephen Harper. Now, basically, like I said, over a period of time, as these changes were happening, the focus on Western interests or issues got smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And by the time it was the Conservative Party of Canada, the focus was on winning power and not on fixing Western interests. Of course, the first leader of that party was Stephen Harper. He had been a Reform Party MP from Calgary. And so like Westerners essentially trusted Stephen Harper because he had been one of us. And when he, of course, he was elected Prime Minister in 2006. And at that time, you know, many Westerners just looked to Stephen Harper as the one who could defend our interests in Ottawa. Of course, he lost the election in 2015 to Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau came in with a mandate of trying to address climate change. And of course, his way of addressing climate change was to phase out Alberta's energy industry, to phase out our fossil fuel industry. He wanted to choke our oil industry so that it could be phased out. So we brought in a number of policies for this purpose, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of these. Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, which many people call the No More Pipelines Bill, because it prevents essentially any more pipelines being built for Alberta's oil to be exported. He brought in Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which some people call the Alberta Tanker Ban, because it would prevent Alberta from shipping its oil off the west coast of British Columbia. And of course, there was other policies, including the carbon tax and so on. Now, in the Constitution, provincial ownership and control of resources is guaranteed, but Trudeau was eroding our control of our resources through these various policies. He was subverting provincial government's control and its ability to develop resources by bringing in these various policies. He was undermining our constitutional right. He was doing indirectly by these laws what he couldn't do directly because of our constitutional rights. Now, with Trudeau's carbon tax, you might remember that Jason Kenney challenged that at the Supreme Court of Canada, and he lost. Like, the Supreme Court upheld Justin Trudeau's carbon tax in 2021. But it wasn't a unanimous decision; it was a majority decision. But one of the justices that did not support Trudeau's carbon tax and thought it could be struck down was a guy named Russell Brown, actually not coincidentally from Alberta. And he wrote a stinging dissent against that carbon tax decision. And among the things he wrote was this. Okay, the carbon tax decision, its implications go far beyond the carbon tax law, opening the door to federal intrusion by way of the imposition of national standards into all areas of provincial jurisdiction, including interprovincial trade and commerce, health, and the management of natural resources. So he was saying that the line of argumentation adopted by the Supreme Court leads to increased federal control basically over every area of provincial jurisdiction. So the Supreme Court of Canada allowed the federal government in this case to circumvent the constitutional guarantee of provincial control of natural resources. And, you know, the implications for Alberta's future were ominous, of course. Now, it's important to point out that even as Trudeau was trying to shut down our oil industry, he was still taking huge amounts of money from our province every year. They want to shut down that industry, but they still, as long as it's existing, they want to take billions and billions of dollars from it. There's a University of Calgary economist named Robert Mansell, and his area of expertise is the transfer of finances from Alberta to Eastern Canada, or at least that's one area of his expertise. And in 2018, he did a calculation that from 1965 until 2018, Alberta had made a net contribution to Central Canada of $630 billion. $630 billion net. So like we gave way more than that, and they gave us some back in services, and the net is $630 billion. That's up to 2018. And of course, they've been taking a lot more every year since then. So it's probably closer to $700 billion by now. So they want to shut down our energy sector and take our money at the same time. Okay, so far I've just been talking about the bad news, but I do have some good news now. As a result of the Quebec separatist referendums, or you remember there was Quebec separatist referendums in 1980 and 1995. The 1981 lost pretty big, and the 1995 was a real squeaker. But after that 1995 result, the federal government sent a reference case to Canada's Supreme Court to ask its opinion on a particular point of Canadian constitutional law. So a reference case isn't where there's like a regular court case where there's two parties fighting. It's a request for advice, for information. So the federal government was asking the Supreme Court for its constitutional law on a particular question. And that question was, could Quebec unilaterally secede from Canada? Could Quebec unilaterally secede from Canada? And the Supreme Court said, no, Quebec cannot unilaterally secede from Canada. However, if Quebec held a referendum on independence with a clear question on independence and a clear majority of people voted in favor, then the federal government would be obligated to negotiate with Quebec over its independence. So the Supreme Court created a constitutional pathway for any province in Canada to become independent through a peaceful, democratic means, through this decision. So here in Canada, we have something that's unique compared to most countries. Like most countries would not allow this, but in Canada, we have this constitutional and legal pathway for a province to become independent. As I said, many other countries do not allow this. And one example, in 2017, the Catalonia region of Spain voted to become independent from Spain, and Spain said no way, and I think they jailed the leaders, and they would not allow that. And some people have said, well, Alberta can't become independent either. Canada will just do what Spain did. But the situations are completely different because Spain's constitution does not allow jurisdictions to become independent. There's no pathway for independence. So when Catalonia took that referendum, and that passed, they had no right to do that. And Alberta's situation is very different. Canada's situation is very different. Canada's constitutional law allows this. So we can do here in Alberta what jurisdictions in most parts of the world cannot do. It's not illegal to pursue independence. We can do this peacefully and democratically. Now, to fill out some of the details of that secession reference case, the Clarity Act was passed by Parliament in 2000. So the Clarity Act is kind of the details, filling in the principles of the constitutional law that Supreme Court laid down in the secession reference case of 1998. Now, all of the things that I've said so far lead to one particular conclusion. Alberta must become independent. Over the last several decades, there have been many proposals by serious people about how to improve Alberta's situation within Canada. I've mentioned John Barr in 1971, Ernest Manning and his colleagues in 1981, and MP David Kilgour in 1988. These were influential citizens, but none of their recommendations were implemented. Most significant, of course, was Preston Manning and the Reform Party of Canada. Alberta voted overwhelmingly for the Reform Party and sent mostly Reform Party MPs to Ottawa during the 1990s. They were good people, and they tried to do their best for the West, but they found that the system could not be fixed. And that is the message of the experience of the Reform Party. Canada's political system cannot be fixed in a way that's beneficial for Alberta. We can learn from history, and we must learn from history. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party could not get a Triple-E Senate and otherwise reform Canada's political system, then it cannot be done. The West has tried to fix Canada, but Canada does not want to be fixed. Therefore, the only remaining alternative is for us to get out. If we keep asking Canada for a better deal for Alberta, they'll just keep laughing at us. They know there's nothing we can do, and so they laugh at us. But if we hold a referendum and vote for independence, they won't be laughing at us anymore. So complaining to Ottawa about unfair treatment or launching court cases against unfair policies like the carbon tax, like Jason Kenney did, or even a referendum on equalization that Jason Kenney did, these things have accomplished nothing. They have been tried and found wanting. Therefore, achieving independence must become the goal if Alberta is going to have any sort of meaningful future. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
We'll probably do a question and answer if you want to do some.
Sure.
We got a mic here. if anybody wants to come up and ask a question.
Thank you.
That's funny because I'm running the live feed right now, and one of the things that was asked and mentioned is this notion that we don't, that basically that we are, that Alberta is already a sovereign nation, that we don't need to ask for Ottawa. This whole notion that was basically raised during the documentary called what's this name of the documentary? Again, what can help me? Canada Delusion. Thank you. So, what is the counter argument, or what you have in mind in regards to that point of view?
Okay, that particular organization, they claim that the Statute of Westminster has made Alberta independent. This is the Statute of Westminster. I encourage everyone to read it. Like, this is a real document from the British Parliament that they passed. This is a real document, and it's really in effect. But it does not say what those guys say it says. This is the key thing. Let me just read to you. Okay, there's a number of different sections in here. The first 6 sections, like, this is what happened with the Statute of Westminster. Up until 1931, all the British dominions, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, even though we were independent countries, essentially, the Parliament of Britain could still pass laws, technically, that would impinge on us. And in 1931, well, it says like here, during the 1920s, the British dominions objected to that. They didn't want to be under that control anymore. And so the British government agreed to withdraw their authority to make laws for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So this is a document that does that. The first 6 or so sections talk about all the different dominions together as a group. And then it breaks down into separate sections for the different countries. So the section that deals with Canada is section 7. Okay, you can read this for yourself online. I'm just going to read you some sections here so you can see what it says. Now, the myth of Canada people say this document abolished Canada as a country and abolished our Constitution, the British North America Act. Okay, this is what it actually says. I'm going to read you section 7.1. Nothing in this act shall be deemed to apply to the repeal, amendment, or alteration of the British North America Acts 1867 to 1930, or any order, rule, or regulation made thereof. So they said explicitly, this does not repeal the British North America Act. That's what it actually says. So when someone tells you that it does something different, just read it for yourself. And also, it mentions how, that there's no more government of Canada after this. If you read section 3 here, it says, the powers conferred by this act upon the Parliament of Canada or upon the legislatures of the provinces shall be restricted to the enactment of laws in relation to matters within the competence of the Parliament of Canada or any of the legislatures of the provinces respectively. So what it's saying is this leaves intact the jurisdiction and powers of the Parliament of Canada and the jurisdiction and the powers of the legislatures of the provinces. So that's actually what this document says. Now, I've told people, just read it for yourself, and I've had people say, well, it's hard to read. It's kind of, this is written by British lawyers in the 1930s, like almost 100 years ago. And so it's not the easiest thing to read, but if you read it carefully, you can see. But I found a shortcut to find out what to do about this kind of situation. This is a court decision from the Supreme Court of British Columbia from 2007 called the Butterfield versus LeBlanc et al. So in this particular court decision, there was a fellow who argued at the Supreme Court of British Columbia that Canada was abolished by the Statute of Westminster in 1931. That was one of his arguments. Like he's got a few arguments in here, and of course the court deals with all of the arguments. But one of the arguments is that Canada was abolished by the Statute of Westminster in 1931. Let me just read you. This is much easier to understand than reading the statute itself. So here on page 3, okay, it says Butterfield claims that Canada does not exist as a federal nation and the provinces are independent nations. It goes on to quote him as saying, Butterfield says, the real provinces are not a part of Canada and are independent nations as established by the Statute of Westminster. So he's making this argument, the Statute of Westminster made the provinces independent because there's no other Canada. So you can read their analysis here. It's about 2 or 3 pages of analysis, just 2 pages of analysis. So here's the court's analysis. This is what they say about that argument about the Statute of Westminster. The parts of the pleadings which rely on these arguments have no substance. Have no substance. So this is an easier document to read if you want to get this Butterfield decision off the internet. The Supreme Court of British Columbia ruled that the argument that Canada was abolished by 1931 Statute of Westminster has no substance. So this is the easy way. This is a shortcut if you want to go through the other stuff. But the document itself does not say that the government of Canada was abolished, and the Supreme Court of British Columbia says the same thing. So that's the end of that as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, thank you for that question. I was hoping not to have to deal with that again. I've have to deal with that at lots of events. Yeah, yeah.
Hey, Michael, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that. You started with the National Post article. Front page there, conversations with Trump, the White House, they've been wooed. How important is it for this movement to happen during Trump's term? And what does it mean to have support from the US when Quebec did not have that support?
Yeah, like it's very important. Like, even though our pathway to independence is constitutional and legal, you can appreciate that, you know, people in Ottawa are going to do what they can to thwart our efforts, even though we're doing it peacefully and properly and democratically. One of the most important aspects of becoming independent, and actually this is, the Supreme Court of Canada talked about this in the secession reference case, the importance of international recognition. And with Donald Trump in the White House, it's very likely that if Alberta was to vote for independence, and actually this is talked about in the National Post article, if Alberta voted for independence, it's very likely that Donald Trump would recognize us as an independent country. So as long as he is president, which is, you know, another 3 years or whatever, if we hold our referendum and vote for independence, he's very likely to acknowledge us. And once the United States has acknowledged our independence, there's very little that Ottawa can do afterwards to thwart what we can do. Like if there's a president of the United States, like let's say after the next election, there's a Democrat who doesn't like our idea of becoming independent. If we become independent, vote for independence after a Democrat is in power, he can refuse to acknowledge our independence. And then that creates a lot more obstacles, a lot more difficulties for us in dealing with Ottawa. But as long as Trump is president, and if he was to acknowledge us in our vote for independence, like I say, basically it would be a fait accompli. Like we would accomplish it, and there's nothing that Ottawa can do. Now, as Jason mentioned, in 1995, when Quebec was trying to get was having their last independence referendum, the government of Bill Clinton did not support Quebec independence. And that would actually, now that you mentioned it, I saw a documentary about that where the Canadian government actually convinced Bill Clinton, I won't go into the details, to publicly speak against Quebec becoming independent, because Bill Clinton himself was very popular in Quebec. And so they got him to speak publicly against Quebec independence, and that potentially swayed some people. But if Quebec had voted for independence and the United States would not acknowledge their independence, that would have created some extra obstacles for Quebec. So having a president that would recognize our independence, if we voted that way, it would be is a huge asset for us. And so we have this window of opportunity while Trump is in power that we might not have after he is no longer president.
Should be noted.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Should be noted too with that Bill Clinton moved U.S. troops close to the Canadian border, to the Quebec border, in case that things went awry in Quebec. Americans are not going to have mayhem north of their border. And so it was also sending a message to them, hey, we don't tacitly approve of this at all. I remember that distinctly when it went down. So
Thank you.
One question I get asked lots, since Alberta's on treaty land, how is Alberta going to separate since we're all on treaty land? We have no control over it. Just an explanation over that would be wonderful.
Yeah, like that's not one of my areas of expertise. Like the secession reference case, I guess this kind of deals with it. In the secession reference case, the Supreme Court mentioned that it would be necessary for a province to recognize the Aboriginal rights as they move towards independence. Like the secession reference case lays down certain principles that Canadians recognize, like including, you know, democracy and things like that. And so Supreme Court mentioned that as a province to negotiate its way out of Canada after winning a referendum, it would have to acknowledge the existing treaty rights of those First Nations peoples. So we can become independent without, like, we don't have to worry about the treaties per se, because as long as we recognize that. And a better person to answer that is actually Jeff Rath, you know, the Alberta Prosperity Project lawyer. That's his area of expertise, is First Nations peoples and all those treaty things. And so, like, sorry, I can't do very good on that one, but Jeff Rath is probably the expert on that more than anybody else. And, you know, he's at the head of this, one of the leaders of this organization. So I don't anticipate, for me, I don't anticipate that as a problem, if you know what I mean, because I have a lot of faith in Jeff Rath. So.
Another question about the kind of what about APP in particular, based on the response that we have from the Alberta court. That decision came this week about the question that APP is asking about independence. I was talking to a friend of mine, and there is probably a few things that need to be fixed in order to sort of pass the test. Are you aware of this, your area of expertise about it?
Are you talking about the question in particular?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the reason, again, that I'm not concerned about the question is I was at a meeting where Jeff Rath said he wrote that question with Keith Wilson, like they're the two top lawyers on this. And they had this Clarity Act right in front of them when they wrote that question to make sure that question would specifically fit the Clarity Act. And that's why they're so confident that that question will be declared to be constitutional, because they actually used the language of the Clarity Act for it. And I know, like, it's a bit of a longer question, and potentially it could be reformed. I don't know, but I don't want to suggest to Jeff that he should do that or anything. I just because that's not my area. But like, I'm not concerned about that question, considering that those guys together wrote that with the Clarity Act in front of them. And yesterday, after that court decision, the APP released a press release. I don't know if you saw that, but it's quoting Jeff Rath and Mitch Sylvester, and they're not all that concerned about that decision yesterday. Like, I know it was we didn't win that one yesterday, but if you can find their press release, I saw it on Facebook, and they were not really downcast by that, because Jeff said that we were kind of expecting this decision, and it slows things down a little bit, but it's not stopping the process. You know what I mean? And so yeah, it's a few weeks of delay, but Jeff was quite confident that that question is going to be declared constitutional and things are going to move forward. So that would, if you can get their press release, it was encouraging for me to see that myself.
It's too hard to get over there. I'm sorry, you'll have to hear me from here. Question with regards to the day after, if a referendum is successful. How does you plan on dealing with things like currency, defense, intelligence, and all of the things intended and unintended that the current federal government does on behalf of the province?
Yeah, good question. Like, how do we intend to deal with all the different issues after the referendum result? Well, actually, the best answer for that I know of is there was a retired professor from the University of Alberta called Leon Craig, who was a Alberta independence supporter. He wrote an article that's still online. It's called The Ministry of Independence Preparation. And so what he's recommending is the Alberta government creates a Ministry of Independence a Ministry of Independence Preparation. So you have like an entire ministry dedicated to those questions. You'd have lawyers and economists, they'd be professionals, and their whole task would be to take a look at all the different things Alberta has to consider and make the preparations necessary for independence. So before the referendum, it'd be called the Ministry of Independence Preparation, and after the referendum, it'd be called the Ministry of Independence. So you'd have an entire government department dedicated to dealing with all those particular issues, because, there's so many things, and like a lot of us as individuals, we can't deal with all those kind of things. Like, we have areas of knowledge in this and that and the other thing, but if we had a ministry with those kind of experts in it, it seems to me that would be the best way to be able to address so many different issues at the same time. So that's kind of the way I would address it. I'm not sure, like, it's not an official APP answer or anything like that, but it makes a lot of sense to me to have a ministry dedicated to looking at those particular issues. Here you go. Oh, sorry.
If Alberta becomes independent, we would be landlocked. How does that guarantee us getting our resources out to other parts of the world when Canada already doesn't want to give us pipelines and already shipping everything down to the States, and it's not doing us any good?
So, like, there's no guarantee, but it's very important that, from my understanding, there's a lot of international goods that are shipped into Vancouver and then sent across Alberta to Eastern Canada. So as an independent country, we'd have the option, if they're going to block us, that we can block them. So that would be one way of doing it. I mean, if they won't let our stuff through, we're not going to let their stuff. That causes a lot of trouble for them. Secondly, most of our trade is with the United States already. So we'd have the majority of our trade would still be in talk with the United States. And thirdly, I'd say, like, it actually doesn't make sense for Canada to blockade an independent Alberta. Like, if we're doing this peacefully and democratically, There is no reason for them to block us, and it hurts them financially. If they blockade us, people there are going to hurt financially too. People there are going to lose their jobs. Are people going to sacrifice their jobs just to spite Alberta? Like, really? I do not think so. I think they'll put their economic interests first, and they'll negotiate what's best for them as well as what's best for us. Like, that's what negotiation is all about. Why would they shoot themselves in the foot just to spite us? Like, it makes no sense to me. So I don't see why people think we will be blockaded when we become independent if we follow this democratic process, a peaceful democratic process that the Supreme Court of Canada in Ottawa has created for us. We didn't make this up, right? Those guys made the pathway for us. We're following their pathway. We're doing it the way they want us to. Like, it makes no sense to me that they would blockade us. But in worst case scenario that they do, we also have options of blockading them. And most of our trade is with the United States. So we would still, it's not that it wouldn't hurt us altogether, but we still have a lot of our economic activity would be going anyway.
What? Sorry. Hello? Yes, what barriers do we have outside of political barriers right now towards referendum? Like, do we have any social barriers, any economic barriers? Like, what prevents referendum from happening within the next 2 months?
Like, that's all the political process, really. I mean, the political process is what slows down the referendum itself. But another barrier I'd say is like convincing other Albertans. Like, there are a lot of Albertans who aren't convinced yet, right? So that's kind of a barrier in and of itself. Now, I think once we get a referendum campaign going, more people are going to pay attention to what's going on, and more people are going to listen to what we have to say. And so I think once the referendum campaign starts going, I think we'll see increased support for independence because we'll be talking about it and convincing people. Right now, a lot of people aren't just paying attention. You know what I mean? They don't really care. Don't want to talk about it because it's not the front burner thing. But it will become the front burner thing when the campaign starts, and I think we'll be able to convince a lot of people that way. But that is a barrier. Like, right now, there are many people who don't, aren't plugged in. And then, one of the issues tied in with that is there are some Aboriginal leaders who are saying they're totally opposed to this and it's unconstitutional. Like, it's not true that it's unconstitutional. And I should mention too, like, the media gives it the impression that the First Nations people are all against this, and they're not all against this. They're just like everybody else. Some of them are against it. Some of them are in favor of it. Some of them are on the fence. And so they're going to listen and pay attention too. And some of them will support this cause.
What's the timeline between Just wondering what the timeline between vote and independence is.
Actually, there's no set timeline. That could potentially be a problem. I mean, it's so hard to say. Like, once we've voted for independence, then that guarantees negotiations, but it doesn't actually guarantee a timeline. And so, we'd have to have some kind of reasonable expectations about achieving our independence. And at some point, we'd have to say, well, those guys are actually, they're just delaying us. You know what I mean? And then we'd have to consider what the options are there. But again, if Trump was in the White House, we'd have a stronger negotiating position. If they try to delay us, they won't be able to, right? We can just appeal that way. But let me just make this as a general comment though too. Like, moving towards independence has risks, like economic risks, political risks, and so on. But staying in Canada has risks too. There is no risk-free pathway for us politically in Canada. It's a matter of choosing which risks you want to face. Should we stay in Canada and let them shut us down and like take our jobs and put our children into poverty, or should we take the risk of independence? That's how I look at it. But there's no avenue without risks involved, whether it's economic or political.
I'm a little loud. I was told that by 2030 that the federal government has plans on getting rid of all gasoline vehicles, and that's only 5 years from now, and that they want us to be electric. And so how are we supposed to, if we become independent as our own country, can we stop that? Can we make our own decision and keep our gasoline vehicles on the road?
For sure. Like, that's a Canadian law. That's Canadian law to get the gasoline vehicles off the roads and replace them with electric. So if we're no longer part of Canada, that's gone. Then we as Albertans get to make that decision for ourselves. And that's one of the great appeals of independence, is when we're an independent country, the people we vote for will do what's best for us. Like the way it is in Canada right now, we vote for a very small percentage of the politicians. Like the leaders are elected in Ontario and Quebec, and they make decisions that cater to Ontario and Quebec. Like those federal leaders, Mark Carney and those people, they make decisions what's best for Ontario and Quebec, not what's best for us. But if we're independent, the people we vote for will make decisions that are best for us, or else we get rid of them. It's just that simple. So if we want leaders who are going to do what's best for Albertans, we got to become independent and vote our own government in that way.
In early July, Elections Alberta approved another petition, which is from Forever Canada. And currently they're collecting the signatures. They did not have any court challenge on that question. Can you explain the difference between that question and the current one from the APP?
Actually, the best that I can do, actually I learned from learned this from you this afternoon, is the Tom Lukaszik's question is a policy question, not a constitutional question. Whereas APP's question is a constitutional question. And so there's a difference between those two in the law. So his question, Lukaszik's question, makes no changes to Canada's constitution, regardless of however anybody votes. Whereas the APP question, creates the opportunity for Albertans to vote for independence, which will create a change in the constitution. So the APP question is way more important than Lukaszik's question. And so from the Elections Alberta perspective, they're trying to be cautious to make sure it is constitutional. I think it's kind of a delay tactic, but whatever the case may be, the courts will have to consider it, and most likely they will declare it constitutional, as Jeff Rath says, and then we can move forward and not have to worry about a subsequent court challenge to that. But the APP question is much more significant and much more important than Tom Lukaszik's question, because it would lead towards independence, a change, if we vote in favor, whereas Lukaszik's question won't lead to a change in anything, regardless of who votes for what. I hope that does good enough. Methenberger, yeah.
Yes, I have a couple of questions and also an article. I have a couple of questions plus an article I'd like to read that I come across that you may not be aware of. What happens if Albertans do vote to leave? Can the House of Commons and other provinces block it?
Well, like it's hard to answer that really yes or no. They're not supposed to block it, but they have to, like once there's a negotiated settlement between Alberta and the federal government, there will have to be votes in the House of Commons, to pass it. So there's a theoretical sense in which they could, but if the federal government has approved it already, it doesn't make sense that they would, if you know what I mean. So there's a theoretical sense in which they can, but practically, I don't think they would, because the federal government has to negotiate the settlement first, and the federal government will presumably have a majority in the House of Commons, and they would let that pass. But so I don't want to say they can't block it, because theoretically they could. Like it's just not likely. They have other paths that they could do to thwart things. But
Okay, thank you. This is an article I come across I read today. In June, a chief electrical officer approved a competing question that seeks to have Alberta make it official policy that the province will never separate from Canada. This petition was approved before new provincial rules took effect that lowered the threshold for citizens initiated referendums to get on the ballots. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah, well, that's Tom Lukaszik's petition, right? So he has a very high threshold. I think it's close to 300,000 signatures to get in 90 days. It's unlikely. I think it's unlikely that he'll achieve that. Like someone said, they calculated that he needs like over 3,000 signatures a day for that whole 90-day period. And it's unlikely that he'll be able to achieve that, I think. And so most likely his petition will fail, which actually is good for our movement because it shows there wasn't enough support for him. But even if he does succeed and they go ahead with his referendum, we can still vote no on that and show our strength, in opposition to his petition.
One more. What percent of Alberta supports leaving Canada? Do you have a rough idea?
Sorry, can you say that again, please?
What percent of Alberta supports leaving Canada? Do you have a rough idea right now? Or?
Like my guess would, there's been different polls at different times. I think some of them have been as high as in the 40s or something. So that's right now it's less than 50%, but it's pretty high. And like I say, though, I think we'd get that up over 50 during election campaign. But the lowest I've seen recently might be like 33% or something like that. So our base of support is going up over time because more and more people are getting fed up, I think. So our base of support is going up. And I think, like I say, we still have the opportunity and the ability to convince enough to get us over the clear majority threshold.
I just have a quick question, I guess. Considering Thomas Lukaszuk is getting more airtime than our premier and our prime minister and just about everybody right now, what is the APP strategic plan for advertising on the mainstream media that quite a few of us don't watch, but we know that there's still a lot of people out there that do?
Actually, I'm not an official representative of the APP. Maybe, is there somebody who could answer that?
We're just doing more education, like that's all we are, is an education group. We're not a party or anything. We're just gonna keep doing town halls like this and educating people, and that's why it's important, if you got questions, come and answer them or ask them.
Yeah, Jason's just mentioning that, 300,000 people have volunteered to sign the petition once it gets going. So that's beyond the threshold. So there's enough people now, like once the once the petition campaign gets underway, there's enough people already to sign, way more than what's needed to sign the petition to get the referendum going. So APP has those records already, and that'll make it much easier to get our petition going at that point.
So Mike, if Albertans vote to secede, we vote to leave, and we go into negotiations with the Laurentian government, which we will be, what's to say they won't stonewall us or drag things on the way they're apparently doing even now to start with? What are your thoughts on a unilateral declaration of independence, Thomas Jefferson style?
Well, I see that as a last resort at this point. Even in the secession reference case itself, like the Supreme Court talked about this. Like Supreme Court said, okay, we've created this pathway to independence. Here is the way to follow. There's a province and the federal government, doing this. And they said if one of the parties follows the process and the other party does not follow the process, the international community will see that. Like the other democratic countries will be paying attention to what happens in Canada. Like other democratic countries have an interest in Canada. Like we're part of NATO and we trade with these people. They're concerned about what we're doing here. And if one level of government, say the federal government in this instance, is not following the law and the province is following the law, people are going to see that. And at some point, we could appeal then for international recognition from democratic countries who see that we followed the process and those guys didn't, and that we'll be on their side. And again, if Trump's in place, that shouldn't be too hard to do that. If he's not, we still have the opportunity to possibly do that. And actually, since you mentioned the unilateral Declaration of Independence, and Jason talked about this earlier today too, in 2008, Kosovo declared independence unilaterally from Serbia, and Canada was one of the first countries to recognize that. And a legal scholar in Eastern Canada said, whoa, this is a problem because Canada is saying it will recognize other countries that unilaterally declare independence. Well, if Canada will recognize other countries that declare independence unilaterally, why wouldn't other countries recognize a province of Canada that declares independence unilaterally? Like Kosovo, I think, became independent from Serbia for unilateral declaration of independence. If Alberta declares independence unilaterally, Serbia is going to be the first one to recognize us because we did that to them. You know what I mean? It's going to be a tit for tat, and Serbia's allies too. So that is kind of I see that as a last resort because we want to try and follow the legal process that's in place. But I mean, we do have that as an option if they're going to stonewall us and we're doing their process that they created for us, and they're going to say, no, we're not going to let you do our process now. Well, we do have this option to follow.
Also, just to comment on the landlocked question, apparently, international law and convention dictates that no landlocked country should be denied access to a seaport. So ask the Swiss and the Austrians and the Slovenians and the other countries, the Slovaks, Czechs, how that works for them. It works very well. So we would actually be given more access to the seaports as an independent nation than we do as a Laurentian colony that we currently are.
Okay, like I don't disagree with that, but me personally, like I'm skeptical about international law in the United Nations. Like I think the real politic of like our negotiating power to get seaports will be our ability to block them if they block us. That's kind of like I just see it as kind of raw politics rather than law. But I mean, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm not disagreeing with the laws that are in place or whatever. But I don't put a lot of stock in international law myself. Sorry. Yeah.
I did want to remind one more thing. Mark Carney is currently in the process of recognizing Palestine as a nation. So this would be pretty bad timing for Mark Carney to not recognize Alberta.
Thank you. That's good. That's good.
Just a comment. You know, what I get out of this delay in the court action, or what I read, I can't remember where the article was that the science is going to be settled, as the Liberals will say, because they're allowing interveners now. And so those arguments will be had. And so once the decision comes down, if we vote in favor of separation, it is what it is. They can't come back. They've missed the boat.
Yeah, like I think that's correct. That if they get it declared constitutional by a court right now, they can't change their minds afterwards. They can't have buyer's remorse on that. So that is an advantage in a sense. Like it's a bit of a delay, but if they declare the constitutional, which they should, then we're good to go.
Yeah, most of us are pretty close to old age in this room. We're putting in $3 billion a year extra pension and $1 billion a year extra on the unemployment. That's $4,000 a year, so that should be about $70 billion we have sitting in Ottawa. Are we going to be able to get that back?
Yeah, like I'm afraid I'm not able to answer that in particular. Like certainly that'll be one of the negotiating terms, but I mean, yeah, I'm afraid like nobody can give you a good answer on that. I'm afraid right now, like it's just speculation unless someone thinks they can. But like there's so much we don't know about what's going to happen, right? Because nobody's ever done this before. Like I say, there's risks involved, but we deserve to get money back. Like that's for sure by fairness. But you know, I just don't know what the outcome will be.
I'm just curious, after the federal election there, I know that some of the numbers are coming out and I'm not sure which numbers were correct and all, but it showed that Saskatchewan was showing as high of support for the referendum as well, possible separation. I don't know much what's going on their side, but it sounds like we're a couple steps ahead of them at this point. If they decide to go with the referendum vote and decide to go after independence, is there an option for them to come into the country of Alberta or whatever after they're independent, or will that be kind of unrecognized by Canada afterwards?
No, like the way it is now, like every province can move towards independent separately. Like it has to be done at a provincial level, separate by each province. But say Alberta becomes independent and Saskatchewan, they can join together and form a new country. There's no problem about that. But you know, it has to be after an independence referendum, after they become independent. So hopefully Saskatchewan will follow our pathway. Like Alberta's got to be the one to lead. There's no question about that. Like we've got a long history of this. Saskatchewan, I'm glad they're in favor, and sometimes their polls are higher, but they do not have the long history of an independence movement like Alberta does, because they used to be more NDP oriented, and their whole culture has changed in the last couple of decades or so. But we've got to lead as Alberta. Like once we go out, like others could come out too, like Saskatchewan. Like Saskatchewan's more likely to leave Canada if we do first. Like they're unlikely to do it on their own, but if we go first, they'll be more likely to come, and then who knows, who else would come, right? So, yeah. But we wouldn't join them though. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Leanne Ton, and I actually already know the answer to this question because I've seen so many interviews with Jeffrey Rath, but just if you can share with us, what are the financial benefits to each of us as individuals as far as income tax? And I know the APP has spoken with the Trump administration about the dollar, and do you know the answers to those things? How will this benefit us? Because that's really, when I listen to him talk, it's like let's do this. I mean, it's so exciting. It's so awesome for Albertans to be able to be independent and not have the burden of taxes and all that on us.
Yeah, like I don't have the details like he does, like Jeff can talk about the particular deals. All I know, and this is good enough for me, we've been sending billions of dollars to them every year in net money. And if we stop sending that, we've got more. Like I know for sure we're gonna have more, lots more. And I I don't know the breakdowns of per family or per person or whatever, but if we're not sending the money there, we get to keep it ourselves. And we do have that money. It's mostly generated, through our energy and stuff, energy industry. So for me, the details of how much per person are like not as important as the fact that I know we will keep that money here and it'll be used for us and for our children and our grandchildren. So sorry, I can't give you the details, but.
I can just add on to that, right?
For me? Oh.
At the Edmonton meeting the other night, Mitch Sylvester said that income tax would be between 8 and 10%. So just right there, money back in your pocket like crazy. So
Will we be able to use Canadian currency or will we be using US?
Like, I mean, that won't be my decision. Like right after the referendum, we'll still be using Canadian currency. We will be using Canadian currency like in the interim while the negotiations are going on. And it's possible that the currency will be part of the negotiations themselves, right? Because that'll affect the economy. But initially, you don't have to worry. It's not like the next day, like we won't have our money or something, right? Because we'll still have Canadian currency as long as the negotiations, and it could be a gradual thing where we bring in US dollars or create a separate currency. I'm not sure. So I can't offer like a firm decision, but I know that in the immediate term, we'll still have the same currency until things get changed. Actually, can I just put a plug in for just a second? Just before I forget, in case anybody's interested, I'm not putting pressure, but I do have some books at the front for sale for anybody who's interested in Alberta independence. So. Yeah, it's in Canadian dollars, yeah. But we do take US dollars if anybody is. We also take gold.
Do you have a timeline on when you're going to vote for separation? You're saying that Trump's only in for like the next 3 years. Are you planning on having a vote in the next 3 years or 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, like my understanding is the APP referendum is the intention is next year, like 2026, because like, yeah, they have to go through these certain delays that are there right now. But once the process gets going, it's realistic to believe it'll be in 2026. Like there's no set date, no guaranteed date, but it's very reasonable to believe it can get going by 2026.
Question from the online audience here. Question is, who is eligible to vote in the referendum? What and under what basis that qualifies anyone to vote?
Like you'll have to be a Canadian citizen living in Alberta, and I'm sure there'll be some kind of residency requirements, but I don't know what. Like it'd be the same qualifications as voting in a provincial election would be my understanding, because it's the same provincial election rules. So whoever is allowed to vote in a provincial election would be allowed to vote in the referendum. So, I'm sorry. The last provincial election? Actually, do you mind answering it? Oh, okay. Anyway, Jason knows this.
Yeah, if you qualified in the last provincial election, then you would qualify in this referendum. So if you're new in the last year or so and you didn't qualify for the provincial one, you wouldn't qualify for this one. Yeah, we'll Quebec had that
problem. Just curious, how are you going to get the young people involved in this stuff? The up and coming voters, 18-year-olds. He's doing.
Like, I'm assuming that APP is going to have some kind of program, but for me personally, like there's just generally speaking, I'm talking generally, the younger age group in general is never as interested in politics as the older people. It's just a different mindset. When you're young, when you look forward, you're looking for your family and your job and stuff like that, and you have less interest. This is just generalizations, about political stuff. And then as people get older, they get more interested in political stuff. And so part of it is like just kind of a natural inclination of younger people not to be involved, if you know what I mean. So you're kind of fighting against that natural inclination. And let me just put in a plug here for old people, if I can. I got this from an APP guy. You know, retired people, he said, are the exact people you want to have for a political movement because they've got time on their hands. They're very good at something. They've done something so good for so many years that they've been able to retire from it. So they're very effective in knowing what to do, and they've got time, and they've got likely have children and grandchildren, so they have incentive. So they've got time, they've got knowledge, they have incentive, and some of them have money. So the people you want are the retired people. Those are the people you want as the core of your movement. And you know, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, not that I'm against the young people, but I mean, I'm not fazed by seeing a room full of old people. You guys are the people who can do something. You guys vote. You guys know. You know what I mean? You guys can get things done. So we do have to get young people involved. I'm not saying we don't, but don't be discouraged by seeing old people because, you know, even like I got first involved, you know, in the independence movement when I was a teenager in the early 80s, and it was old people then too. And they would say, oh, this movement has nowhere to go. It's just a bunch of old people. You know what I mean? And so that generation dies off, but the next generation of old people is there. And so it's always going to be a movement of old people in a sense, but there's always going to be old people. So, so anyway, I'm kind of diverging. Like I don't want to disparage the need to get young people in. We have to need young people in, but again, don't be discouraged when it's old people because the old people are the core of what we're doing.
I appreciate that so much what you said just now, but I wanted to let you know that we've been doing a lot of work with the millennial generation right now. We have 5 millennial children, and they're fired up.
Oh, good.
They're on Instagram, they're on TikTok, and they are fired up. Their friends are fired up. Spruce Grove alone, there's probably 5,000 millennials who are fired up.
Oh, good.
And so I don't want anyone to be discouraged to think, oh, we're just a bunch of old people. And your explanation was fantastic.
Thank you.
The way you presented that. So yes, we have the time, the money, the energy, all of the things. Well, I have influence on my kids. They will do what I tell them to do. And so will their friends because they're scared. So anyway, so I just want to get that out there to the public, to the general public, and to other Albertans that yes, the younger people are, but they're busy. There's soccer, there's all of the things. So don't be discouraged. We're not just a bunch of old people. This movement is 10 times bigger than that.
I have good news for you, though. The largest block in favor right now is the under 25. So over 50% of the under 25 are already in favor. The smallest block is the over 65, the ones with the pensions and worried about their Canadian pension. That's the largest block that we need to focus on. The ones that can't get homes and can't build their families, the young people already know Canada's broken. So over 50% support already there. It's the 65 plus we need to focus on.
And then plus we have the Freedom Calendar getting out on YouTube. So if you guys want to check it out, he's got a lot of good stuff there. Yeah, no, and that's what we need to do. And we need that to get to the younger people too, but the younger people are starting to come out, so it's a good sign.
Just before I ask my question, I guess I'm 30 now. Wow. Am I a millennial? Okay. As one of the younger people, if I can call myself that still. I've got 2 kids and 1 on the way, and coming out to these things in person, it does take a lot more effort. You know, you've got the diaper bag and snacks to pack. So I just want to encourage for every one person in person, you see my age, there's probably 30 that would have been there. I see like at least 4 or 5 husbands that have wives and multiple kids that aren't here, but the husbands are here. So just know, yeah, for every person you see my age here, there's at least 10 more, if not more. So the question I had is actually from my sister, and she's wondering, is Danielle Smith in favor of Alberta independence or not? And if she's not, is that a roadblock for us?
Like I can't answer that authoritatively because I've I know people who say they've talked to her and I've got contradictory answers. So some people say one thing and some people say another, and I haven't talked to her personally about it. So I can't give a solid answer. Sorry about that.
My question is, how many signatures would be required to put this on a ballot?
Like my understanding is it's about 177,000. Yeah. So we need to get a petition with about 177,000 signatures in 120 days to get the referendum on the ballot. But my understanding, as we mentioned earlier, the APP already has more people than that who've agreed to sign, so that once the process starts, they can just go to those people and get the signatures right away. They don't have to like walk around trying to get people to sign.
First, I'd like to thank Melita and Marlon in their efforts to go across our region to build our chapters up. And we're working, like we've got in Drayton Valley, we just got commitment here in Breton, and tonight there was a fellow who said for Warburg, and so we're working east. And the other thing I heard in regards to the young, in building these, oops, it went dead. Oh, there it is. In building these chapters, I just read that they're going after the universities to set up chapters within the universities to catch that group.
In regards to the younger vote or the younger population, I was at the Alberta Next panel in Edmonton. I'm not gonna talk about the whatever. I want to talk about the young people like about my age, and what I'm starting to see is that there's a growing support of independence. Like people about under 35 are starting to speak publicly about it. And as I mentioned, as the lady in the back was saying, it's not because you don't see him, you'll see young people that are not. There's just a underrepresentation, but just be mindful that there are people, and I just recently yesterday I saw a lady from church from the young adults group, just FYI.
I was watching a podcast a few days back, and it was kind of a debate about the separation. And they were both in favor of separation, but the one gentleman said, okay, what's our hurry? We have to take our time and make sure that a massive majority of Albertans agree when the referendum comes. So my concern is, are you worried that it's taken 50 years plus 100 years? What's the rush in that sense? We need to make sure that this is going to work. And we might need more time. Is it too rushed to be in 2026?
Yeah, like that's like this is a legitimate concern. Like I don't want to dismiss that concern, but for me, the fundamental thing is we'll never know when the right time is, if you know what I mean. Like I understand, like people argue, and this is a legitimate argument, let's spend the next year like trying to educate people and build the support. Like that makes sense to me. But I mean, other political events can happen in that period of time too that will sway it one way or the other. There's just so much that's unpredictable about the future. And like I say, with Trump being president right now, that's a particular window. And so for me, like I'm ready to go as soon as possible, I guess. But like that, other people would be persuaded. Like this is a thing, like this is an area where reasonable people can disagree. You know what I mean? Like some people will be persuaded, let's take time, and some are like me would say, let's go. And like because it's not like a cut and dry answer to it. It's kind of what you're willing to live with. Like for me, I'm willing to take the like let's say we did it next year and we get 45% and we lose. But I would say, well, 45% is a huge percentage. And the other thing to keep in mind, Quebec lost 2 referendums. Did it hurt Quebec that they lost 2 referendums? Was Quebec worse off when they lost? Like, are you kidding me? Like, Quebec's way more powerful, right? I'm not saying inevitably that would happen to us, but the loss of a referendum, like, it isn't necessarily as devastating, as we might think. So, like, I'm willing to take the risk. Like I say, it's not unreasonable to argue, let's take more time, to convince more people. That's not unreasonable at all, but I'm ready to go for me. And so everybody has to decide for themselves, right, what they're willing to do.
One of the best perspectives I've heard in the last while was if we looked at it as though we were already a free country and we were sovereign and had our own way already, and Canada approached us and said, would you like to join us? And here's what we're offering when you look at what we're going through right now. There's absolutely no way in hell anybody would take that offer in their right mind.
Yeah. Excellent. Good point. Yes. Oh, like, I would like just ask people.
Here's just a thought that I was posted to my neighbor here. If we did have a referendum and lost, at least maybe Ottawa would pay a little more attention to us, and you could twist their arms a little bit more.
No, I agree.
And I think the main thing is to get after that Pierre Poilievre there and change his mind over this equalization transfer payments to every Tom, Dick, and Harry down east. That this is the main annoyance. This is one of the main annoyances of all Albertans, is how much money we're giving away. And as I drove here, my neighbor drove us here, there's no white lines or no yellow lines on the pavement. We really got to get after our government to look after us too, eh?
Yeah, that's right.
Just like to make a comment about getting after Pierre Poilievre. He's not our friend, and the federal Conservatives are not our friends. Equalization as it stands now was designed under Harper with Pierre Poilievre in his cabinet. If Alberta separates, 37 MP electoral districts will be wiped off the Canadian federal map. The Conservatives would never win another federal Canadian election, minus Alberta, if Alberta separates. So expect to see every Conservative MP telling you that it is a terrible idea.
Oh.
Are we voting yes or no? Right on. Thanks, everybody. That was a good question and answer. I just wanted to mention that there's signature, or you can sign if you haven't signed with the intent to sign the referendum. You can put your name down back there and add your name to the number, which is at 300,000 already, 127,000 more than we need to start the referendum. There's also a donation bin if you feel led to give to cover the costs of the hall. And like Michael said, his books, come take a look and let's buy a few. And yeah, so I'd like to thank Jason Levine for live streaming this, and Max for live streaming this with Freedom Calendar on YouTube and all the other streaming apps. Jeff Gooderham for praying, and obviously Michael for the presentation. Thank you. Everyone get home safe.